Hello, and welcome to the second part of our lecture about bilingualism. In this part of the lecture, I will tell you more about bilingualism in the world, as well as bilingual education. So, you already know that there is many more languages in the world than countries. There is only around 200 countries in the world, while we know that there is at least 6,000 to 7,000 languages. Of course, very many of those languages are very tiny, spoken only by tiny groups of people. In fact, 90% of those languages have less than 100,000 speakers. So that means that the majority of people speak at least one of the most common languages. So even those who also speak a minority language will also, in addition to that, have one of the biggest languages. So even though there is 6,000 to 7,000 languages, the 11 most common languages are spoken by 70% of all people in the world, both as L1 and as L2. And these are the languages that are the most common, the 11 most common languages. And you see that Arabic is, of course, in the first 5, and so is Chinese, and so is Urdu. And these 3 languages are spoken commonly in the world because of just the population of people who learn them in their country as their first language. And then, of course, we also have languages like English and Spanish, which are very common, both because they're popular second language choices, but also because of colonies in the past. So many countries had English or Spanish, sometimes French, added or introduced as main language due to colonization. So for this reason, in most languages, there is more than one language spoken. But countries can have different policies regarding which language is officially used. So there are countries which are just monolingual. That still doesn't mean that all the people in the country are monolingual. There will often be little groups of minorities. For example, in the UK, there is a large minority of people speaking Urdu. In the States, there is a large minority of people speaking Spanish, but in general, the countries are mostly monolingual. Then there are countries which are officially monolingual, so there is only one official language in the country, but they're actually very multilingual. So there is one language that is used in all the offices, all the governmental institutions, and everybody knows it to some extent, but in fact everybody speaks other languages as well. And you can think of the UAE as an example of that. There is only one official language. It is officially a monolingual Arabic-speaking country, but in fact almost everyone speaks also another language, whether it be English or Urdu or Tagalog or Polish. And then another type of countries is countries which are officially multilingual. So countries where there is more than one official language. But that does not mean that all the people in those countries are bilingual. On the contrary, very often there will be one part of the country where people only speak one of the languages, and one part of the country where the people speak only the other language. And Canada is one example. You will find very many English-speaking Canadians who don't speak French, and French-speaking Canadians who don't speak English, even though Canada is an officially bilingual country. Same is true of Morocco, for example, where Arabic and French are both official languages. So bilingual countries, sometimes countries are bilingual, but the speakers in those countries are monolingual. And the other way around, sometimes countries are called monolingual, but in fact, most people who live in those countries are bilingual or monolingual. So how is it possible, you could say, that in a bilingual country, not everybody is bilingual? How is it possible that people will have, for example, in Canada, will have access to learning both languages, and yet it won't happen? They will not end up bilingual. Well, in fact, this is often the case. For example, in Belgium, even though all Flemish-speaking children have French lessons and all French-speaking children have Flemish lessons at school, only 15% of people living in Belgium are bilingual. So 85% are monolingual, even though they do have lessons and they live, in theory, in a bilingual country. So what are the reasons for this? Well, one important reason is the attitudes towards the language. So, according to some researchers, there are different types of bilingualism. There is additive bilingualism, where it's perceived as a good thing to speak two languages. It's perceived as both languages being very high status. For example, English and Arabic in the UAE are both thought to be very important. This is why most people learn to speak both of them, people who grow up in the UAE. But then there are also situations where people are encouraged to only speak one of the languages, right? So for example, Pakistani immigrants in the UK will be perceived as better if they speak English, but worse if they speak both English and Urdu. So those are very different situations. And again, just as with second language acquisition, we come to this idea of motivation and context and perceptions as an important factor in learning a language. We don't just learn language because we get lessons or because we hear it. It needs to bring something into our lives. It needs to feel us better, needs to give us a better identity, better opportunities, better higher social status. There needs to be something. So very often when you feel like learning a second language will make you assimilate to the majority, that is subtractive bilingualism, and you will not stay bilingual. So either you will hold on to your minority language and refuse to learn the majority language, or you will learn the majority language and lose the native minority language. In both cases, you'll end up monolingual. So you can see, again, just as in second language acquisition, or you could argue in general in language acquisition around the world, in people who aren't small babies, there are all these factors affecting the extent to which we learn a language. So the socioeconomic status, timing, and how much exposure you get to each language, how many educational opportunities you have in each language, what the status of the language is in both your family and in the wider community, social and cultural integration, how familiar and happy you feel with the culture of the language that you're learning, whether there is a need for you to function in both languages, and finally, whether you get education and assessment and teaching in both languages. So all of these factors are important for becoming bilingual, and all of these factors have to be considered when we talk about education and educational policies. And when I see you in class, we're going to talk about how all of these factors play out in the UAE context. So try to think about all of that, and we will discuss it in detail in class. Thank you.